The first session is on the CEFR, an acronym for a Common European Framework for Languages, Learning, Teaching and Assessment. The CEFR today is in fact much more than a book or a document. It is an apparatus with such a worldwide impact that it makes sometimes wonder us if the European in its title should not perhaps be deleted. That's why I marked E in red. In my presentation, I will follow this outline. I will begin with why the CEFR was published in the first place and its main characteristics. I will continue with how it has evolved in 20 years. And I will then focus on how it can be useful to professionals in the field of language education and how it has actually been used, to conclude with some recommendations and questions to consider in its implementation. Let's start then. The Blue Book was published in 2001 after very wide consultation, and it was the culmination of many years of work on how to improve language learning in Europe. The work was done by the Council of Europe, the Modern Languages Division of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, and the kickoff was in 1991 at the Intergovernmental Symposium in Dresden. I hear some background noise. Is that me? Can you hear me all right?
Oh, we can hear you loud and clear, Neus.
Okay, thank you, great. But apart from being a very European initiative, actually the work on the Common European Framework, because it was supported by the Council for Cultural Cooperation, in which Canada was an observer. It gathered quite a lot of interest.
How I view the chats.
Because the US National Foreign Languages Center actually provided fellowships for some of the authors of the CEFR. So the CEFR was a very European initiative, but from the very beginning, it counted on the support and acknowledgement of institutions and countries internationally. Why was it developed? To assist the planning of language learning programs, including what Professor O'Sullivan will be talking about, the need to relate and to provide interfaces between primary, secondary and higher education, about the content of the language learning program, focusing on how students learn, how teachers teach, and how students do better, and assessments. And planning of language certification was also another of the objectives of the CEFR, and the planning of self-directed learning, which was the seed that was planted in order to raise the learners' awareness of their present state of language, how they're going to go on in the process of learning, and how they can achieve their objectives. In order to be able to help in planning, learning, assessment, and teaching, the CEFR described language under the action-oriented approach, which focuses on language outcomes rather than on how language organizes itself, and placed from the very beginning the learner at the center of the learning process. The learner in the Common European Framework of Reference is referred to not only as a user, but as a social agent. The CEFR also has three principal dimensions. It looks at language learning, not only taking into consideration the language activities that any user of language is going to perform, but also the domains in which they occur, the context, and the competence on which the learner needs to draw to engage in these activities. So we look at what you have to do in the language, in what context you have to do that, and what competences you need to mobilize to be able to successfully carry out these activities. And one of the novelties of the CEFR, which have been highlighted in the companion volume that was published in 2020, is that the focus on the 4 skills, listening, reading, speaking, and writing, was simplified into 4 kinds of language activities or modes of communication: reception, which included listening and reading; production, both spoken and written; interaction, also spoken and written; and mediation, which included translating and interpreting. And I'll briefly talk about mediation again in a while. And again, taking into consideration that context of use is key in language activities, the CEFR describes the 4 domains of language use: public, personal, educational, and professional, and provides a series of supplementary labels for locations, institutions, persons, etc. I'll briefly now refer to graphical representations of the what in the CEFR. And the first one is this graph, which I think illustrates very well the interaction between the 4 modes of communication. For interaction, we need to understand, and whenever interaction may not be straightforward, we will need to mediate between receiving a text or understanding a text and sharing the contents of that text with the person we are attempting to communicate with. The other graph that illustrates the huge effort in describing overall proficiency, language proficiency, is in number 2, where we have a clear diagram with the general competences of any human being, a learner, which include knowing, knowing how to act, knowing how to be, and knowing how to learn. And all these competences are key to acquire communicative language competences, be they linguistic, sociolinguistic, and pragmatic. With this in mind, the CEFR includes numerous scales describing the communicative language activity including reception, production, interaction, and mediation, and communicative language strategies with the same modes of communication. These activities are based on actual performances of learners. The CEFR has an empirical basis, and the scales that you see in the CEFR are based on the observation of actual speakers of the language at different levels, so that the differences between one level and another can be highlighted. And the key 6 levels in the CEFR, which I am sure you're very familiar with, are A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and B2. And these levels are normally divided into sub-levels depending on the needs of the context, that is, the needs of the educational system of different countries. In some countries, for example, Spain, A2 is divided into 4 sub-levels in primary, whereas in Sweden, where they start learning English later, but where English is a much more familiar language, A2 is divided into 2 levels only. So there's a need to adapt the levels whenever they are adopted. And I will return to the adaptation issue just a bit later. In 20 years, the CEFR has evolved a lot. The Blue Book is translated into more than 39 languages. A number of countries have published language-specific exponents for their L1. In Spain, you have El Plan Curricular del Instituto Cervantes. In France, you have Les Référentiels. And in English, you have the English Profile. And not only some countries have developed their language-specific exponents for the different levels, there's a number of versions developed in Japan, in China. There's an attempt in India to also have the CEFR-I. So all this contributed to the wide amount of resources that accompany the Common European Framework. The framework was also very well received. It was adapted very fast. It is presently referred to in L1, L2, L3 foreign curricula in all contexts and levels of education. In theory, the CEFR was published to help with adults and young adults, and it's now used in primary and in secondary. It's mostly used in formal assessment, and of course, it's also received a lot of criticisms. On the basis of the translations, on the basis of the publication of the language-specific exponents, etc., there's, I'm sorry, I'm checking time. There's an interest in listening to what's going on in relation to the CEFR. And this is why the Council of Europe has put together a platform where the learner is at the center and the languages of schooling are also in the center. And these two main boxes are surrounded by the different languages that are present in each context. And this platform includes a variety of references, documentations. It's actually a toolbox where users, teachers, policymakers, etc., can find help in curriculum design, can find exemplars on what a C1 exam looks like, etc., etc., etc. And all this information has gone into the development of the companion volume to the CEFR, which is slowly becoming the new CEFR, which meant to highlight the main issues proposed in the CEFR, but also to incorporate what has been going on in the 20 years that the CEFR has been around. How can the CEFR be still useful these days? The purposes of the CEFR in 2001 are still valid. The CEFR is very useful as a reflection tool for all those involved in language learning, teaching, and assessment. It helps us, professionals, to think of what we can do to improve, considering our context and our needs. It is also useful to describe and align teaching and assessment to a common standard. We can thus contribute to compatibility. Is my secondary school leaving exam compatible to the Swedish secondary school leaving secondary exam? How can we talk to one another? In Europe, for example, we have a common currency, but if I wanted from Spain to go and study in Austria, I had to take exams in Austria, and little by little we're getting to the point where somebody having a language certificate with a CEFR label enables you to use that certificate that you obtained in your country to go somewhere else to study or to work. So compatibility and transparency is one of the main assets of the CEFR. to assist educators in relating language learning aims to real-world language use. Educators can benefit from the CEFR extended description of what language looks like, how it is learned, and how it is best taught. And it's not only a question of teachers and learners only, it's teachers and learners, but also parents, society at large, and policymakers, of course. How useful has it really been? Well, at the very beginning, the CEFR was taken up by assessment organizations, and the main worry was, is my B1 your B1? With time, we developed a bit further, and we ended up by asking ourselves, what's my B1 like? How does it compare with your B1? What's your B1 like? We began to be more specific, more detailed in our alignment, and more interested in content rather than on labels. And this has to do with how different contexts adopt the CEFR and how far they adapt it in the process of aligning their language programs, language policies, language examinations to the CEFR. The impact has varied from country to country and from context to context. Spain is a federal system, and the impact of the CEFR has been, in general terms, quite wide, but in some regions it has had a higher impact than in others, depending on the context and the resources. It, of course, I've already said that, it's been most adopted in formal assessment and by certificate examination systems. In learning and teaching, it has been implemented, but I think that this is very much something that we need to focus on more. The uses are often claimed at the macro level. Most curriculums all over the world, I think now, have fed on the principles and recommendations of the CEFR, although it's often more, the use is more espoused than real. There's been a huge amount of teacher training, and teachers seem to know very well what the CEFR means and how the recommendations can be put into practice. But if we observe classes, the action-oriented approach is not always what we see. The learner is not always at the center of the learning process, and the focus on communication is not always there. And the users are partial rather than fully aligned. In some cases, there's a focus only on one level or one education, or one level of the CEFR or one level of the educational system, or there's a focus on reading into writing but not on speaking, etc. Being very much aware of this, the Council of Europe published a recommendation for European members, which is, I think, very useful, and it might be useful for Taiwan because it really outlines very clearly what is best to do when you want to use the CEFR as a tool for change, as a catalyst for what's going on in the country in relation to language learning and teaching and assessment, etc. Some recommendations. Before getting into the CEFR, or before organizing a new policy in relation to the CEFR, it is good to consider the lessons learned and consider the importance of focusing not only on assessment, but on learning and teaching. The other recommendation is to try and counteract the very often observed behavior that many people claim that they are aligned to the CEFR, and they implement it, but very few people actually have carried a formal real alignment. There's a lot of reference to the scale levels rather than in-depth knowledge of what the scale level labels mean. What I mean about scale levels is A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. And I think that what we need is to go into what the descriptors say and what that means in our context. There's a need for a context-based, focused, step-by-step approach. Rome was not built in a day. It's taken 20 years in Europe to have a better understanding of the CFR, and we still have a lot of gaps. So my recommendation would be to read carefully the documentation, select what is relevant for our context, plan the actions to take, act, disseminate, monitor, and document. Sometimes there's a break between the dissemination and the monitoring. It is not clear that once everything is clear to everybody and has been well disseminated, the approaches, the novelties will be maintained in time. Use digital resources in all steps as much as possible. The CFR webpage in the Council of Europe has now an online searchable tool where you can select the descriptors that you need. This is a time-saving resource that facilitates accessibility, but also allows quick publication, quick collection of data, etc. And last but not least, I think this is the most important one, involve all stakeholders. You need to combine top-down and bottom-up approaches. So involved everybody. Policy making is not enough. Teacher training is not enough. Involving all teachers is enough as long as they know that they can share and they are being monitored and that they can monitor themselves and document what they do and what advantages or problems they identify. Questions to consider to finish. Is the CFR learning, teaching and assessment approach useful for Taiwan? How? If it is useful and you decide to adopt it, what adaptations will you need? I am sure that Jessica will be talking about this later today. What changes or modifications need to be done to the CFR model? What are the implications for the current system in relation to any baseline study that you have already conducted? Who is in charge? Policymakers, of course, will be in charge, but champions are needed. Leaders in grassroots, leaders at schools, teachers who engage and commit themselves to doing what they think is best for the students and how they're going to share this. Which resources will need to be mobilized, not only in terms of funding, but in terms of logistics. And which timeline? I know that in Taiwan, you have a clear timeline in your mind, and that maybe you will have to go, instead of from the top to the bottom, you might want to go in reverse with your timeline. Which resources will you need to engage whom, to adapt what, and to achieve what you want to achieve in the timeline that you need to achieve. So I think that with this, I will leave you, and thank you very much for your attention.